The rope bit deep into the woman's wrists, her swollen belly rising and falling in shallow bursts, while the wind off the cliff lifted strands of her hair and tossed them against her damp cheeks. She stood with her back to a sun-warmed cottonwood, ankles bound, the coarse fibers pulling at her skin every time she shifted to ease the ache in her spine. At her feet, a tin cup lay on its side in the dust, as though someone had set it there for water and then changed their mind. The child appeared first, not the mother. A thin, barefoot girl, no more than 6, stepped into the narrow trail where a rider's shadow stretched long in the afternoon glare. She looked too small to stand in a man's way, but she planted herself there, chin lifted. Her dress was the color of faded cornmeal, torn at the hem, and her eyes were wide and unblinking under a mess of sun-bleached hair. The rider reined in, the leather creak of the saddle loud in the stillness. He was a broad-shouldered man, towering from the height of his sorrel, the kind of presence that seemed to make the air change shape around him. Matthew Calloway, bare to most, watched the girl without speaking. She didn't flinch. "My mama's baby's comin' now," she said, voice high but steady. "She's tied to that tree. You gotta help before." She glanced past him, toward the cliff where the wind curled upward from the depths. The unspoken end of her sentence hung there like the drop itself. He shifted in the saddle, scanning the rock ledges and scrub. Tying a woman near a cliff wasn't just cruelty, it was a warning. Folks who did a thing like that often stuck around to see if fear finished the work. His hand brushed the butt of his Colt, but his gaze returned to the girl. "Where?" She stepped aside, pointing with a small hand smudged in dirt. The path bent sharply, falling into a pocket of shade beneath the cottonwood. That was where he saw her, the woman, struggling to keep her weight on her feet, belly heavy under a plain calico dress. Her head lifted when she heard the horse, and for an instant her eyes met his. They were clouded with pain, but there was something else beneath it. Shame, maybe, or the stubbornness of someone who refused to beg. Bear swung down from the saddle. The ground was dry and loose beneath his boots, the smell of warm dust rising. The girl hurried ahead of him, keeping close to the tree as if her body alone might block the sun from her mother's face. "Name?" he asked, already drawing the hunting knife from his belt. "Lillian May," she murmured, as though the name were something precious that might break if she said it too loud. He set the knife to the rope, slicing slow and careful so as not to startle her. The fibers gave with a dry snap, curling apart. She flexed her fingers, wrists raw and ridged, and leaned back against the tree for a heartbeat before straightening. "You hurt bad?" he asked. Her eyes slid away. "It ain't the hurt that matters." The girl reached for her mother's hand, small fingers curling into the hollow of Lillian's palm. Bear noticed the faint bruising along her forearms, the way the rope marks disappeared beneath the sleeves. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to make her smaller than she was. A sound carried on the wind, faint, but close enough to make the girl stiffen. Male laughter, brittle and sharp, followed by a woman's voice pitched high with scorn. Bear knew the tone. In-laws, by the sound of it, returning to check their work. "Can you walk?" Lillian glanced toward the trail, then back at him. "If I must." "You must." He took the girl's arm gently, lifting her into the saddle. She clung to the horn, bare feet dangling. Bear offered his other hand to Lillian, palm open. She hesitated, then placed her own in it, letting him steady her to the stirrup. The brief contact was warm, grounding, nothing like the rough hands that had left the bruises. They moved quick but quiet, Bear leading the sorrel into a narrow cut between two boulders. The stone smelled of sun and lichen, the passage just wide enough for the horse to squeeze through. Voices grew clearer on the other side of the cottonwood, the words now sharp enough to catch. "Reckon she's still there?" "Better be. Ain't no man fool enough." The rest was swallowed as Bear guided them deeper into the rock. He kept his head low, scanning for movement. Lillian's breath was uneven behind him, but she said nothing, her free hand resting protectively on her belly. The girl looked back over her shoulder once, just long enough to see shadows moving where her mother had been tied. By the time the cut opened into the scrubland beyond, the wind had shifted, carrying the scent of sage and the dry whisper of grass. Bear swung into the saddle behind the child, one arm steadying her, the other guiding the reins. Lillian walked beside them, her steps measured, skirts brushing the dust. They didn't speak until the sound of pursuit faded entirely. Then Lillian glanced up at him, something like disbelief softening the lines of her face. "Why risk it?" she asked. Bear kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "Because she asked." The girl's small voice floated up between them. "You'll keep us safe now?" His jaw tightened. "I'll try." From the ridge behind them, a single shout rose, angry, distant, and promising trouble yet to come. Lillian stopped, looking back toward the cliff where the wind still played with the empty rope. For the first time since he'd seen her, her expression broke, not into fear, but into something colder. She turned back to the trail, saying nothing. Bear didn't need words to understand. Whatever had been left behind on that cliff wasn't just a rope, and it wasn't finished following them. Josie rode before him in the saddle, her small back straight, hands curled around the horn as if she'd been born to ride this way. She didn't fidget, didn't ask questions. The only sign she was a child at all came from the way her bare heels tapped lightly against the sorrel's flank, as if keeping time to some tune only she knew. Bear studied the crown of her dust-blonde head, the stubborn tilt of her chin. Most children this age looked away when a man's gaze lingered. Josie didn't. They followed the dry wash until the shadows began to stretch long and the land softened into cottonwood and sage. Lillian walked beside them, one hand pressed to her lower belly, the other clutching the stirrup leather. Her breathing had eased some, though each step still seemed to draw something from her. Bear slowed the sorrel without a word, letting her set the pace. "You don't have to help," she said once, not meeting his eyes. "It's not your fight." "Don't look like you can walk away," he replied. A gust of wind carried the faint scent of smoke from somewhere behind them. Lillian's shoulders flinched, but she kept her gaze on the trail ahead. Bear let the silence stand, knowing some truths took their own time to be spoken. When they reached the bend where his land began, marked by an old fence of weather-bleached rails, Josie turned in the saddle to study him. "They'll come after us," she said, her voice even, as if naming the weather. Bear met her look. "Let 'em try." Something flickered in her eyes, a testing of the truth in his tone. She seemed to file the answer away like a stone in her pocket, not for now, but for later. The house came into view low against the horizon, a squat, square place of clapboard and fieldstone, the paint long gone to gray. A corral stood empty to one side, and beyond it, the slow roll of pasture climbed toward a ridge. Amos, the old hand who'd stayed on after his knees gave out, sat in the shade of the porch rail, whittling a stick into curls. He looked up, his blade pausing mid-stroke. "Trouble." "Company," Bear said, dismounting. Josie slipped down without help, landing soft in the dust. She didn't run to the porch, didn't cling to her mother. Instead, she circled the yard, eyes moving over everything. Water pump, barn door, the stack of cut wood, like she was memorizing escape routes. Bear watched her for a moment before offering his hand to Lillian. She took it, but only for the weight of stepping down. Up close, the marks on her wrists were clearer, darkened now that the blood had returned to her hands. She drew her shawl over them quickly, though the fabric barely covered the raw skin. Inside, the air was cooler, shaded by drawn curtains. Lillian paused just past the doorway, as if unsure she'd be allowed further. Bear nodded toward the table. "Sit." She obeyed, lowering herself slowly. Josie came in behind her, silent as a shadow, and stood at her mother's side. Bear set a plate down, bread thick as a man's thumb, and a tin cup of water. Lillian hesitated, glancing toward him. "It's food, not a bargain," he said. Her hand trembled slightly as she tore a piece of bread and passed it to Josie before taking any for herself. They ate without speaking, the sound of it quiet in the still room. Bear leaned against the counter, arms folded, the low light catching the hard lines of his face. When the last of the bread was gone, Lillian spoke. "He's gone to trade cattle. 6 months. Might be more. His people said they'd keep me safe." Bear didn't answer. She met his gaze for the first time then. They meant safe for themselves. Outside, a lone rider passed on the main track, dust rising behind. Voices carried faintly, a man's laugh, the word heart among the rest. Town was already talking. Bear saw Lillian catch it too, her eyes flicking toward the window, jaw tightening. "You're welcome here till you find where you want to go," he said. Her lips curved, not into a smile, but into something almost like disbelief. "And if they come here, then they'll wish they hadn't." For a moment, neither moved. Then Josie climbed into her mother's lap, resting her head against Lillian's chest. The woman's hand came up to smooth the child's hair, slow and rhythmic, as if to anchor them both. The sun dropped lower, painting the walls in muted gold. Amos's voice called from the porch that someone was riding hard from town. Bear's head turned, but before he stepped outside, he looked back at Lillian. Her eyes were on him now, steady in a way they hadn't been before. "Don't let them take her," she said quietly. The sound of hooves grew louder, closer, the rhythm of pursuit. Bear's hand found the doorframe, his shadow stretching long across the floor. Whatever trouble was coming, it had found them quicker than he'd thought. The town lay under a pale morning sun, the kind that showed every flaw in the clapboard and dust on the windows. Bear's boots struck the boardwalk with a slow, even rhythm, Josie walking just ahead of him, her small hand curled around the strap of a burlap sack. Lillian kept close behind, her shawl drawn tight, eyes lowered as if the street itself might bite. They had come for flour and salt, nothing more, but Main Street never let anything pass without weighing it in its mouth first. Conversations paused as they moved between the mercantile and the post office, glances cutting sideways, whispers moving faster than wind. On the porch of the livery, Prudence Galloway sat like a queen in her worn calico, ankles primly crossed, a parasol shading her narrow face. Her voice, pitched just loud enough to carry, caught Lillian mid-step. "Some women can't keep a man, so they find one to pity them. And some men, well, they take whatever's easiest." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it had the sharpness of tin tearing. Lillian kept her head down, but her fingers tightened on the shawl. Josie glanced up at Bear, her jaw set in that unblinking way of hers. He said nothing, moving them past without slowing. Inside the mercantile, the air smelled of molasses and gun oil. Mr. Howard, the shopkeep, greeted Bear with a nod, his eyes flicking to Lillian and back as if doing sums. Bear placed the flour on the counter, coins beside it. "News travels quick," Howard said, the words hanging between politeness and curiosity. Bear didn't take the bait. "Need the salt too?" Josie wandered to the barrel of hard candy, looking but not asking. Lillian stood still, a fixed figure among shelves of calico bolts and tobacco tins, her gaze on the sunlight strip that fell through the front window. When they stepped back out, Prudence was gone, but her words seemed to have soaked into the street boards. Two men leaned against the rail by the smithy, their voices dropping as Bear passed. He caught enough, cliff, pregnant, fool move, to know the story had grown teeth. At the edge of town, Amos was waiting with the wagon. He tipped his hat at Lillian, offered a hand to help her up. She refused it, climbing on her own. Bear loaded the sack, then sat beside Josie, taking the reins. The road back was quieter, the clatter of wheels and the distant call of meadowlarks filling the space where talk might have been. Lillian stared ahead, but her face had changed. The stillness now was not from fear but from something harder, heavier. "Why don't you tell them the truth?" Josie asked suddenly, her voice clear in the open air. Lillian's eyes closed briefly. "They wouldn't want it." Bear kept his gaze on the ruts in the road. "Truth don't change for what people want." She turned to look at him then, studying his profile like she might find the reason he'd taken the risk at the cliff. But whatever she saw, she kept to herself. They reached the ranch as the afternoon leaned toward evening. The air was warm, but the wind carried a bite of coming change. Lillian went inside to put the supplies away, her skirts brushing the doorway. Josie lingered in the yard, drawing lines in the dirt with a stick. Bear joined her, squatting to meet her eye level. "You listen close now. Folks'll say things to get inside your head. You don't let 'em." She nodded once, as if she'd already known. "Mama says words can bruise same as hands." Amos called from the porch, a shadow on his face. "You'd best hear this, Bear." Inside, the lamp was lit though the light outside hadn't gone. On the table lay a folded scrap of paper, the handwriting jagged, ink blotched as if pressed down hard. Bear opened it with 2 fingers. She belongs with her own. Bring her to the cliff at sundown, or we come take her. No name, but no need. The words smelled of the Galloways as sure as dust smells of the trail. Bear's jaw worked once before he refolded the note and slid it into his vest. Lillian stood in the doorway, a bag of beans in her hand, her eyes locked on his. She didn't ask what it said. Maybe she already knew. From somewhere beyond the ridge, a hawk cried, the sound thin and sharp in the fading light. The day pressed down heavy, the kind of heat that slowed breath and made the air shimmer above the earth. Clouds stacked low on the horizon, dark but unwilling to break, and the wind carried a taste of dust instead of rain. Bear moved through the yard with measured purpose, checking the harness on the wagon as if each buckle might keep trouble a step further away. Inside, the house was dim against the glare outside. Lillian sat at the table, both hands wrapped around a cup of water she hadn't yet drunk. Josie was on the floor with a bundle of twine and a small piece of wood, trying to make something that looked like a doll. Every so often, she glanced at her mother, as though to make sure she was still there. Bear stepped in, wiping his hands on a rag. Wagons near ready. Lillian looked up, her eyes holding the shadow of the question she didn't ask. You think they'll come? I know they will. She nodded once, like she'd been waiting to hear it plain. She tried to drink, but her hand trembled, and the water sloshed against the tin lip. She set it down with care, her gaze fixed on the ripple in the cup. Around midday, she began to shift in her chair more often, a faint crease between her brows. When she rose to tend the beans on the stove, her movement was slower, deliberate. Bear caught the change. You all right? Her answer came too quick. Fine. But when she turned away, he saw her grip the counter, her knuckles white. Josie noticed too. She abandoned the doll, padding over to stand beside her mother. By afternoon, the light outside turned gold, the heat pressing harder. Lillian's face had gone pale under the tan, a sheen of sweat on her temples. She was kneading bread at the table when she froze, both hands braced, head bowed. Bear crossed the room in 2 steps. It's starting. She drew in a slow breath. Early yet. Could be hours. Could be sooner. A horse's distant whinny carried through the open window, followed by the dull thud of hooves. Bear moved to the doorway, scanning the ridge. 2 riders cut across the slope, the sun flashing off the barrels of their rifles. Even from here, he recognized the set of Cyrus Galloway's shoulders. They're not waiting for sundown, Bear said, his voice low. Lillian's fingers closed around Josie's. What will you do? Get you out before they're close enough to see where. He moved fast, gathering what they'd need, bedroll, waterskin, the sack of food Amos had set aside. The old hand met him at the barn, eyes grim. They've likely got more behind them. You take the canyon trail. Bear nodded, loading the wagon in quick, efficient motions. Lillian came out, one arm wrapped around her belly, the other holding Josie close. She didn't look back at the house. The horses moved under the weight, hooves thudding against the dry earth as they turned toward the narrow track behind the ridge. Bear kept them steady, though his gaze swept the hills. The sound of pursuit was still faint but growing. They hadn't gone more than a mile before Lillian shifted beside him, her breath catching. Her hand pressed low against her belly. Stop, he asked. She shook her head. Just go. But the next jolt of the wagon made her bite her lip hard enough to draw blood. Josie climbed onto her mother's lap without being told, wrapping both arms around her. Bear tightened his grip on the reins, pushing the team a little faster. The canyon walls began to rise on either side, shadows deepening. The air here was cooler, carrying the scent of stone and sage. It was also a trap if the Galloways caught them inside. Bear kept the team moving, glancing back at the entrance. A hawk wheeled overhead, its cry slicing through the heavy air. Beneath it came another sound, hooves striking rock. Closer now. Lillian's head tipped forward, a strand of hair sticking to her cheek. Bear, she whispered. If they take Josie, they won't. You don't know. I know. His tone was final, steady, as if he could shape the truth by saying it. They rounded a bend, and the trail widened into a shelf of flat ground beside a line of cottonwoods. Bear pulled up, setting the brake. He climbed down, offering his hands to Lillian. "We'll walk from here. Easier to hide tracks." She slid down into his arms, her weight pressing into him for a moment before she found her balance. Josie followed, clutching her mother's skirts. The sun was dropping now, the gold light thinning into amber. In the distance, the drum of hooves was no longer faint. Bear looked toward the narrow path that led deeper into the canyon. "This way," he said. They moved quick but careful, boots whispering over dry grass. Lillian's steps slowed with each tightening of her breath. Josie glanced back often, her eyes searching the trail behind them. When they reached a curve in the path, Bear stopped, listening. The hooves were close, too close. He turned to Lillian. "We'll have to leave the trail." She looked at the rocks rising steeply to their left. "Climb, climb." He lifted Josie first, placing her hands where the rock jutted enough to hold her. She scrambled up like she'd done it before, small and sure-footed. Then he turned to Lillian, his hands steadying her as she began to climb. Each movement was slow, measured, but the urgency in the air made his own breath shorten. Halfway up, the echo of voices reached them, Cyrus's drawl, clear and certain. Bear glanced down. Dust rose at the canyon mouth, 2 riders pushing hard. "Don't stop," he told her. Her foot slipped once, and he caught her weight before it could drag her down. They gained the ledge just as the first rider came into view below. Bear flattened them against the rock, the shadow of the cottonwoods hiding their outline. From here, the world felt still, except for the pounding in his ears. Josie pressed close to her mother, her small hand gripping the edge of Lillian's sleeve. Below, Cyrus reined in, scanning the canyon walls. His voice carried up, cold and certain. "You can't keep her forever, Calloway." Bear didn't answer, but his eyes never left the man, measuring the distance, the risk, the time they had left before choice turned into action. The dawn came thin and sharp, the horizon brushed in pale rose and silver. Bear led them along the high trail above the canyon, the wagon rattling over ground that sloped toward emptiness. Below, the wind curled up from the depths, carrying the dry scent of stone. Lillian sat in the back, Josie's head on her lap, one hand stroking her daughter's hair in slow, steady passes. The road narrowed until the cliff pressed close on one side and the drop yawned wide on the other. Bear kept the team tight to the rock wall, eyes scanning for movement ahead and behind. The morning air was still, but the quiet felt wrong, like the pause before a door slams. Lillian shifted, her hand pressing low against her belly. "It's time," she whispered, not to him exactly, but to the air. "How long?" Bear asked without looking back. She drew a sharp breath, her voice tight. "Not long." A sound broke the quiet. Hooves, hard and closing fast. Bear turned in the seat. 2 riders burst from the ridge trail behind them, Cyrus in the lead, his face set in a look that had no room for negotiation. Bear snapped the reins. The horses surged forward, wagon wheels clattering dangerously close to the edge. Josie gripped the side, her eyes wide but dry. The gap between them and the Galloways narrowed with each turn of the wheels. A jagged rock outcrop loomed ahead. Bear pulled hard to the left, skirting it close, but the wagon jolted violently. Wood splintered, one wheel striking stone and cracking. The wagon lurched, throwing Lillian forward. She caught herself with both hands, then doubled over, a low moan escaping. Bear was off the seat in an instant. "We can't stay here." He swung Josie to the ground, then reached for Lillian. She clung to his neck as he lifted her, her breath hot against his collar. Josie pressed close to his side, one small hand gripping his coat as they left the wagon behind. The path ahead narrowed into a goat track hugging the cliffside. Bear moved steady but fast, the weight in his arms shifting with each contraction that rolled through her. Her jaw was set, her eyes locked on some point beyond him, as if she could walk herself through this by sheer will. Behind them, Cyrus shouted something lost to the wind, but his boots struck the trail at a run. Bear glanced back once, enough to see the rifle slung over his shoulder. They reached a small shelf of ground beneath an old cottonwood, its roots clinging to the rock like a hand holding on. Bear set Lillian down carefully, Josie kneeling beside her, fingers trembling as she smoothed her mother's skirt. Cyrus closed the distance, his boots grinding against stone. "She's coming back with me," he called, voice steady as if the cliff weren't yawning just beyond his shoulder. Bear stepped between them, his revolver drawn but angled toward the ground. "No, she isn't. You can't stand out here forever." Cyrus's eyes flicked toward Lillian, then narrowed. "She's Galloway business." Bear's voice stayed calm, but there was steel under it. "Not anymore." The moment stretched, the wind curling between them, tugging at coats and hair. Cyrus took a half-step forward, his boots edging into shadow. "Careful," Bear said softly. Cyrus's gaze hardened, and in that heartbeat, his foot slipped on loose gravel. His arms pinwheeled once before he crashed onto his side, sliding toward the drop. His fingers caught a jut of root, holding him just above the fall. The rifle clattered away, striking stone and disappearing into the canyon below. Bear didn't move to help. He just watched, breathing steady, as Cyrus clawed his way back to solid ground. When the man finally stood, his chest heaving, something in his eyes had changed. He backed away, muttering, and then turned, retreating the way he'd come. The silence that followed felt bigger than the canyon itself. Lillian cried out, her hand clamping around Bear's wrist. "It's happening." There was no time for shelter. Bear dropped to his knees beside her, his hands steady, his voice low and certain. Josie stayed by her mother's side, wiping her brow with the edge of her shawl. The first light of the rising sun broke over the ridge, spilling gold into the hollow where they sat. Minutes passed, each one stretched taut, until a sharp cry split the air. Bear caught the child in his hands, the small, slippery weight pulsing with life. Lillian's face softened, her breath shaking as she reached for the baby. Josie leaned in close, touching the tiny fingers that curled instinctively around hers. "Brother," she whispered, as if naming him would keep him safe. Bear sat back on his heels, his gaze sweeping the canyon edge where the wind still played. The danger had passed for now, but the road ahead would not be simple. Still, there was a steadiness in his chest he hadn't felt in years. He looked at them, mother, daughter, newborn, and thought of the empty rope he'd left behind days ago. Some men measured their worth by the land they owned or the cattle they branded. For him, it was here, in what he carried away from the edge and set down where the wind couldn't take it. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.